Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Professor Urjit Yajnik. You can find part 1 through the link in the description below. We hope you enjoy this episode.
So long as there are newer and newer experiments happening, so long as we have domains that have not got explored, it is not going to be over. The day you find that your technology as well as your knowledge base is enough to do everything, that only then will science end.
So, now we want to just to begin with address a few cynical perspectives that a small fraction of the general public and unfortunately some educated professionals take about theoretical physics. It is that the field itself is not directly relevant to anything we do in our lives, and that the work will seldom have any kind of direct application for the benefit or progress of society, and therefore it's not worth the time, effort, or funding that it requires. So I know that I've read some people like G.H. Hardy who said in his autobiography that fields like abstract math and theoretical physics that are so far displaced from our daily experiences, they're pursued primarily for the sake of intellectual reasons. So it doesn't matter whether the work has any applications at all. But as a professional, what do you have to say to such people who say that this is not a worthwhile endeavor?
Yeah, so actually, just to add to what you said, there is a New York Times cartoon, I think, which is sometimes quoted, where there is a street in New York and there is a person sweeping the street, and there is a baker and there is somebody, and everybody is like in deep thought, and the caption says, the world is beginning to contemplate the meaning of special theory of relativity, or something like this. So it is quite natural to question what is the relevance to common man or to the society of this kind of intellectual developments. But I think that one has to recognize that scientific discoveries have completely changed the landscape of our thinking about ourselves. So, at a time when people thought that there was the celestial sphere, there was a sphere that was like painted, or there are some things stuck on this sphere and that rotates around us. From there, now we have opened up to the universe as a whole. And so the Keplerian revolution, you can say very simply put. Kepler's probe says, oh, the Earth and planets go around the sun instead of sun going around the Earth. So you may say, so what is the achievement? Well, it was a big achievement because people began to completely rethink about themselves. And, the kind of emotional debates that quantum theory has generated because of the lack of predictability now and what goes on in the brain, whether the brain will, that the brain is governed by quantum mechanics is bothering a lot of people. So these researches, it's like a whole ground below you has shifted, and you do not even realize it. It's difficult to understand that even the great Albert Einstein believed in a perfect, everlasting Newtonian universe. The person who, with such intellectual, stupendously intellectual might, achieved general theory of relativity, was not able to accept the consequence of his theory of, general relativity. So when Hubble discovered the expanding universe, Einstein was shocked because, and earlier on, Alexander Alexandrovich Friedman, this mathematician, wrote to him saying that the solutions are expanding and recontracting kind of universes. Einstein more or less tried to ignore it and even tried to modify his theory to fit it. So the kind of, and if you just go a little bit farther back, people didn't know what galaxy was. Nebula, which are just large clouds in our galaxy, and galaxy is a whole complete new setup. were not known before. But now that they are known, after the big telescopes came up in California in 1910, 1915, that has completely changed our perception of ourselves. Similarly, radioactivity determined that the age of the world is almost 3 to 4 billion years. And that changed people's mindset completely. You know, we just woke up to the fact that the human species doesn't exist just for 10,000 years or 50,000 years or a million years. So these time scales that science has brought up to us are not just idle things. They have shaped entire civilization. Now, there are a lot of people who still strike a compromise between certain things that they learn from their family values and so on. And it is difficult to reconcile the traditional family values or tribal values or your group values, whatever the level of the group, nationalism and so on, with the understanding in science. But the two are interacting dynamically all the time. And it would be incorrect to say that the one has no application to the other. So when people ask me this question that you are pursuing something idle, I try to point out that you are using today a fan, an automobile, a cell phone. This electricity was an idle pursuit when Faraday was trying to swing magnet in and out of an electric coil, you know. Or when Maxwell tried to put together the mathematical equations, making them consistent. It was some elaborate, abstruse mathematical exercise. I mean, Maxwell didn't even have access to vector calculus. So he was doing some very elaborate manipulations with symbols. This all may appear, but it led to electromagnetic waves. And I mean, we are not looking back from that even now. We are still cutting new grounds in it all the time. So what was done 50 years ago, 100 years ago, what mathematicians did in the 18th century, 19th century, began to be used in quantum theory. And what we now do as quote string theory, thinking that it is going to solve our current problems, may become useful for something else in the future. So these are not idle pursuits at all, you know. So I think we have to explain to the public by giving example, especially of electromagnetism, which most people will understand, that it sometimes takes almost 100 years for it to become fully flower as a usable science. But that should not stop us from doing science. And the way we understand geology, geological timescales, the way we understand the weather, you know, it requires fluid mechanics, it requires all kinds of abstruse things. But people studied, you know, some unknown little insect in Tasmania. Well, ultimately, it all has some effect because it ties up with so many other things. So I think that makes the cynical viewpoint only very limited. And it is our duty to convey to them what science has done for human society.
Okay, so we need to be more explicit about the fact that these things require a lot more foresight and like a kind of generational thought. Like it's not even if you don't say it now.
That's right, right.
So we just spoke about one cynical perspective that most people, like a lot of people from the general public might take, but another set of strong opinions that people take, and this is probably more true of professionals, is that foundational physics itself has now stagnated and that all the low-hanging fruit has been captured in the golden age of Feynman or Schwinger. And of course, there's some great physics, quote unquote, great physics has emerged, like ADS-CFT correspondence and even dark matter, dark energy, all that. But do you think this viewpoint has any merit whatsoever, that it's not a viable career option for someone who wants to be a successful researcher or something like that?
I think it will remain a viable option for another 50 years at least, because you mentioned dark energy. It has only been discovered. Nobody has an explanation for it. So maybe several of these issues, dark matter, dark energy, and the Big Bang itself, and as you know, the so-called inflationary universe, that the scale of universe is so large that it is difficult to understand it purely from point of view of gravity and the laboratory level matter. I mean, the ordinary matter that we know. So there has to be some intervention of some kind of matter that is none of these. So without any of all of that, so all of those issues are not understood, and so the basic physics is going to continue to expand. And now so many um, astroparticle and cosmology experiments are active that what they turn up we never know. On the neutrino front, gravitational waves are being measured, so what they may reveal about neutron stars, about nuclear matter. By the way, I always try to um, remind myself and friends that elementary particle physics started as an offshoot of nuclear physics. Ultimately, people wanted to understand the nuclear force. Just that the nuclear force per se has turned out to be, people have given up because it is too difficult to actually provide a force law that would explain all the nuclei correctly. But maybe from deeper understanding of the quark gluon physics, we may get more and more control over the nuclear force understanding. So there are a lot of frontiers which are open and where both mathematical developments and conceptual developments will continue to happening. So right now, of course, the threshold has become somewhat high, but as I say, in this American system, you are not forced to learn everything that was earlier done and discarded, or every technique that is under the sun known. But yeah, it does seem to be a bit forbidding because sometimes you don't know how many things have been already explored and discarded. So it's a bit harder, but at the same time, it will remain relevant for quite some time, I think. I don't think it is about to shut shop anytime soon.
And I mean, there are so many things that we still have to explain. Like, I mean, coming back to like really old philosophical questions like the arrow of time and all of that. I mean, you say that for the next 50 years at least, you see that it's not going to become irrelevant. But like, what about these extremely fundamental questions? Like some of these questions that people like really dismiss at this point. Like, do you think that there will come a point where we won't have any more use? Like, we'll have discovered all the theory that there is to discover.
That's a very good question. And, I mentioned the satellite-borne and astroparticle experiments, but Europeans have already approved also an accelerator project. Even the Chinese have a very ambitious accelerator project in principle in place, 80 TeV or some number like that. Really large circular ring. And Europe is developing its own. So even at the collider front, there may be some new grounds that may be broken. So I think so your question was, it was about arrow of time you mentioned, and what else?
Yeah, no, questions like those, like we still have to answer, and some people are dismissive of it because it's not yet hard science, something like that.
So what I would say is that so long as there are newer and newer experiments happening, so long as we have domains that have not got explored, it is not going to be over. The day you find that your technology as well as your knowledge base is enough to do everything, that only then will science end. But right now, these new observational techniques that we are deploying, depending on what they keep turning up, we may continue to have new things to explore. So it is not going to stop anytime soon, in my opinion.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
but it will have to depend on newer things to play with. It may even be playing with individual level atomic physics, or creating materials for quantum computation, any of these things, which are all challenging domains of experience. See, by domain, it doesn't mean you have to go to another galaxy. Even in in your laboratory, if you have not done a certain kind of configuration of matter and tested its properties, it is an open question. And so long as those remain open, I think that this kind of inquiry will remain open. In a way, you can say quantum gravity suffers because there isn't even enough evidence. And there is nothing you can do as a controlled experiment to study it. But anything where controlled experiments or explorations remain possible, the inquiry will remain open.
Okay.
If inquiry begins to be directed devoid of any clues, then there will be a problem, which is what Feynman used to worry about.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
just speaking a bit more about evidence, people like I have this opinion. The school of thought has been gaining a little bit of prominence lately. Like you see people like this, the book Lost in Math that some a physicist called Sabine, I think she's written about string theory and how even though there's no evidence, we keep spending billions of dollars on increasingly larger reactors. Like this is gaining prominence. So, and evidence is like crucial to science. So would you say string theory, although important and really beautiful to look at and resolves a lot of problems in other fields, do you think it would be safe to call it borderline unscientific?
So you have to distinguish between the activity string theorists do and the verbal messages they put out.
Okay.
Okay. I'm sorry to say, I have a lot of string theory friends and whose work I respect. I think the problem of string theory is that it did not give the kind of results or understanding that we expected. On the other hand, string theory has produced immense amount of beautiful mathematics, as you say, and an understanding of quantum theory and clever approaches to quantum theory, like topological methods and use of very fancy mathematics to crack understand quantum field theory. So there are definite pluses because of which you cannot stop somebody from, you cannot tell string theorists you are wasting time. But if string theorists promised in 1985 that the end of all of quantum gravity is in sight within 10-15 years, well, I think they overestimated. So uh, so I think there is no argument to say this endeavor should be stopped, even the very mathematical ones, because pure mathematics has had its own track, and eventually it has become useful because ultimately it is product of human mind, and we are deploying the same mental faculties and same cognitive faculties to understand the world. So if Kronecker or whoever, or if Cauchy developed complex analysis, it may have looked very exotic at that time, but in 20th century they were designing aerofoils using complex analysis. So these developments in mathematics, even when they are quote pure mathematics, even Mr. Hardy would, it may probably break his heart, but his formulae may get used in some enumerative or combinatorial problems at some
Yeah.
point, in computer science or.
Yeah.
So yeah, there were. So in fact, that is what I was trying to um, talk against, the silos that were created by the end of 19th century's European science and mathematics. That certain things were superior, that certain things were pure. Those silos are breaking, and it is important that they keep breaking because I think
Okay.
they all have to talk to each other. So ultimately, I think the future should always remain an open thing. So I have this aphorism for myself. which is somewhat overstated, but it basically says be dogmatic about the past, but be pragmatic about the future. By that, I mean that the experiences you already have and data and empirical evidence you already have, it is your duty to cast it in a theory. You must have the intellectual wherewithal to put it in perspective, whether it becomes very mathematical or whether it is even stamp collection, but you must have that assiduity and acumen to put it together in an organized way. So that is what I mean by being dogmatic, not dogmatic, but it's just a catchphrase to say, therefore, you should be able to be dogmatic about the past. But for anything in the future, do not try to reimpose the same structure. Uh, Tentatively, yes, maybe more things will keep fitting into the structure you already have, but you may have to forego everything and rethink afresh. So about the things that have not yet happened, you should be completely pragmatic. So be dogmatic about the past, but be pragmatic about the future is a good
That's a
thing
good
to
way
have.
to remember it. Yeah.
So we want to move into a more general topic now about how research and even learning should be approached keeping one's career in mind. So most researchers have one thing in common, like passion for the field that they're working in, but at the same time, their work is the job. So for someone working in research, should their focus be on becoming a successful researcher by choosing to work on a problem that can give them high citations or H indices, or should they be simply doing good research in a specific field that they're passionate about? Or both approaches are equally valid. So what's your personal view on this?
No, I think I have heard several very high achievers who have mentioned that you must pursue your intuition, your passion. And you may have to, quote, make a compromise because these metrics like H index or publication rate and so on, they are demanded of you, and I think legitimately so. Although they sound like nuisance or they sound very mercenary, I think they are good to have because some metrics have to be there so that society understands where you are going or what is your value to, at least even to your own peer group. So it is a good thing that those metrics are there, but I think you should try to remain compliant with it and follow your own passion. Now, if remaining compliant itself takes away all your time, well, then you better give up your passion because bread is more important. Because if you will lose your position, then you will not be able to do either of them. This way, at least you will remain compliant and earn a living, and you will continue to enrich science. So it may not remain completely to your fascination, but it will be worth continuing to pursue. So, but I think the fundamental principle remains that you should pursue what interests you and engages you, because that is when you will really be able to engage with it with full energy.
Okay. So, like similarly, like we want to talk about it from a student's perspective now. Does there come a time when we as students have to shift our primary motivations for pursuing research from our innate curiosity about exploring questions to something a lot more strategic, thinking more about the prospect for discovery and being almost agnostic about our like passion to the field or what problem, like what field the problem itself comes under, as long as our work has like potentially promising returns? Does there come a time when we'll have to adopt this whole practical attitude, and what should we do if you find ourselves in this position?
So at some point earlier, I mentioned this kind of next threshold of maturity where when you go to research and when you develop a perspective on the subject. I think from my personal journey and having seen what my peer group does, I think there comes a point where those things fall away by themselves. The non-questions or the less important questions, they kind of get relegated to the side on their own. You do not have to consciously say, oh, let me put aside things that fascinate me because I now have to do this calculation. It almost never happens like that. You can yourself gauge that certain things that you thought were a curiosity appear to be less important or trivial or not non-questions of some kind. And certain other things you begin to realize as you get into research is that there have been such outstanding problems that you are not going to crack it by thinking about it for 5 months or even 5 years perhaps. So you then put it on the back burner like rest of the community has done. So there does come a time when you realize that it is good idea to join the peer group in what they're doing as the mainstream, because, and I think there is a certain logic to it, because the peer group does consist of very bright people and who have come from many different backgrounds. The very intensely trained ones, the very innovative ones, they are all there. And if all of these people have decided that this X, Y, or Z problem is either not important or there are no productive approaches to it, it is better to also put it on the back burner. You don't have to switch it off, but you certainly should put it aside, because if you try to keep banging your head on it straight ahead, you may not get anywhere. But I think that, as I again said, you should ultimately follow your intuition, because maybe you have in the back of your mind actually hit upon how you will get that answer. And it may be a 10-year project even that you get into. I, again, as by my own aphorism that I said, about future, you should never be too dogmatic. So I would not be able to give you a dogmatic advice that set things aside or join the bandwagon either way. Because we know somebody like Perelman, you know, this Russian mathematician,
Gregory Perelman,
who then gave up the Fields Medal and all that. This gentleman has just single-mindedly worked on something without any compensations, any great things, you know, no achievements in life, no money, more or less. But I think he achieved something great. So it would be wrong to give very strong advice of any one type, because we want to remain pragmatic about what is to come. This actually happened to me very early in my career as well, because, and you may put this clip somewhere else if you like, but when I was as a student trying to decide, although I was very fascinated by elementary particle physics, everyone, all my teachers and other senior theoretical physicists I knew from personal contacts and so on, said there are no jobs in particle physics and that you will starve. And they've used very strong words and sometimes even derogatory remarks, how the hell will you survive in a subject like this and so on, and draw comparison to somebody very bright. So all of those things were there. And so I was really trying to weigh whether I should change this was an undergraduate days, so there was plenty of time to just shift. But I met one professor, in fact, in IIT Kanpur, who thought about it for some time and then said, you know, it will not be correct for me to give you any bulk advice. There is no standard advice for this, because maybe you are one person who will make it into particle physics. He said the thing people are telling you is objective reality. There are very few jobs. And at that time in the 60s, particle physics was in some sense saturating, because there was just plethora of data and no theory. The new theories had arrived, but somehow in India, they had not got accepted very well, the standard model. So people were thinking that this is going to be like in the woods exercise, not with any clear shining glory in the end. And so they were advising like this. But this professor told me that maybe you will find the solution. So who am I to tell you to not pursue it if you have a lot of passion for it? And so I think in that spirit of keeping an open mind for the future, one should never give too strong an advice on anything, but put across the objective facts that this is how it is, this is how the sociology of science is, this is how funding works. But now you decide what you want to do. So then you should follow your own passion about it.
Okay, so essentially have an open mind, but also be careful. And like there is no right answer for
You
this.
should be aware of where the realities are. And yes, you may be forced to make a compromise as well, because ultimately that is also, life is important. So, but you should try to keep an open mind and do try to take your passion seriously, not to say it is just a starry-eyed nonsense.
Okay. But if you are someone who is driven by your passion and you find yourself in such a position, then on a personal level, do you like what would be the wisest thing to do? Like to try and develop a newfound passion for whatever it is that you are sort of being coerced into, or what? What should people do?
Yeah, so this becomes a much larger, I think it's sort of a hypothetical question. When you get to that stage, see, that way I think human mind is very flexible. So I'm again jumping between subjective and objective answers. And my objective answer is that human mind is flexible. Um, and so I think you end up the person ends up making the correct adjustment. I know some friends, for example, who after doing fairly serious theoretical physics went into engineering. Like I was saying, in USA, the high-tech industry was willing to take people with high-tech mathematical physics training or so on. So I'm sure that they made an adjustment in their mind, and because they have flowered in whatever they did well after that. So it is not as if it is a negative thing to readjust. And how to readjust, how you do it, will probably come automatically at that point. So one objective, again, I mean, going back to the previous question, one of the other objective things to keep in mind is the peer group. So when you quote, follow your passion, see, we end up, as scientists, we end up getting a lot of very exotic proposals, which are really off the wall. You know, they are neither here nor there. But that person is very passionate about that particular idea. Now that also is not a very desirable thing. It is not a good idea to be stuck in a rut, which is actually wrong. So there are some people who will keep arguing about a wrong position and make it into, quote, essentially a political problem by shifting grounds, by just going into loops of things that cannot ever be settled and so on. I think at that point, a good compass would be to see what the peer group as a whole is doing and then try to reassess. I'm not saying that you should automatically conclude that you are on the wrong track, but you must if you are really getting isolated in your endeavors, then you should try to see the other point of view, try to get a more honest response from your friends and peer group. You know, that is where sometimes being at a conference and just having wine and cheese together, or just joining people for dinner together, those kind of interactions may sometimes suddenly give you a perspective on what you are doing, which are not biased in any way. And so you can pick up from those things. Also actually read the papers of what the mainstream is trying to think and what they are saying. And then if somehow your idea is really being discredited in some way, then I think it's a good time to move on. So I would not say that while I'm trying to keep things open for the future, there are actually some pitfalls which should be avoided. And the best compass is, again, the peer group, which should not be jumped upon as a bandwagon. but as a sounding board, and to see where you stand.
Would you say this is more true of some fields than others? Like, would you say this is more true in theoretical physics than, suppose,
No,
AI
no, no. I
research?
think this thing has pervaded all the fields of exploratory scientific exploration, including antiquities, um, geology, evolution theory, in biology. Everywhere it happens that sometimes people get latched onto a false start, and they're so fascinated by it that they sometimes end up making a political question out of it. And this has happened too often in all the fields where there has been exploratory things. Of course, in theological discussion also one can be stuck on a particular position, but since theological positions do not have to be validated by independent evidence, you can hold on to what you like. But the lesson of science is that you may get caught on the wrong foot if you take a particular position too strongly, because ultimately it needs validation from science. So in archaeology, people have tried to falsify data in sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. So falsify, of course, knowingly, but sometimes interpreted things wrongly. So all those things have happened. And in science also, people sometimes miss hints and or interpret them wrong. I think at the end of 19th century, there was actually it's a funny thing. It's actually a string theory of atomic physics. You may find it. I think even Lord Kelvin was involved with it. That various configurations of how to lay out knots or string or something like that. And it gave 17 possible solutions. And today we have like 15 elementary particles. So maybe only 2 more have to be found and it will fit the 17. So, but he was completely on the wrong track, and people stopped thinking about it the moment Rutherford's atom and all the real understanding of nuclear science began to emerge. So one can be on the wrong track sometimes, and one has to retrieve. One should have the mental agility to retrieve oneself from it, to take a more objective view of why you had passion for it and what is still worth retaining in it, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I hope I've answered it. What was the question?
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. So in a nutshell, basically, we can say that this whole success versus passion issue is a lot more complex than just one of the other, and like you have an algorithm to live by, like a dogmatic thing. So yeah, I think this
No.
definitely deserved a lot of, like, you need to have long conversations about it.
But the very simple summary I would say is that what the peer group says and what the society at large is saying is a reasonable compass. One should not be dictated by it. At the same time, it is a good thing to keep watching.
So now we would like to talk about some less academic stuff, more like your perspective on the education system in general. So do you think there could be any structural changes that can be inculcated in the secondary education system, secondary school education system itself, that could make research a more popular or accessible option for kids?
So there are two schools of thought. One is that if you have to go for advanced research, then it is better to go the more or less the current way we have, where you in fast forward teach a lot of things. But there is also the exploratory model of learning, and I have been involved as a outreach exercise with an NGO called Eklavya, which operates in Madhya Pradesh, where they have developed science textbooks where you learn all of science by exploration in the middle schools. So the explore and learn method of science may be useful, but I think it may not be very useful for theoretical advanced areas. Also, even experimental developments have been so fast. So one has to achieve some kind of a blend.
Okay, so like on that note itself, like what are your thoughts on the education system in India relying so heavily on metrics? So for example, one's entrance examination ranks or school grades. Do you think that could be an accurate measure for just someone's
Yeah, I
abilities?
think the assessment system should not become a big disincentive to studying. You should not just laud only for toppers of mathematics or toppers of subjects and so on. The school should try to bring out the multifarious personality that we have. And we know certain school systems wherein every child is allowed to become best in something, one thing, so that they have a lot of self-esteem. So assessment system metrics are just a shortcut because we have far large number of people to train, and we are trying to achieve it in short with less resources. But I agree with you that it should not be too metric oriented. It should be more, education should be more broad based and bring out a person's innate qualities.
All right. So we're almost at the end of this interview. So we just want to ask you for, do you have any final takeaways? Like, what is one thing that the viewer should take away from this video? What is the one piece of advice you would say?
Follow your passion.
Okay. All right. So
Yeah, that pretty much summarizes the whole thing.
yeah. So Professor Rujit, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks for this wonderful session. And thanks to our audience for tuning in. We hope to see you all in our future episodes.